And we move to our second presentation. We leave the stereotypes of Vikings and of women, and we move on to film. Another interesting contact area between Sweden and the United States. Popular culture is very popular today, of course, in Sweden, American popular. And we move now to Kim Fahlstedt, who has a PhD in cinema studies from Stockholm University, where he's also currently a postdoc, although he's residing in Washington, D.C. right now,
yes,
where your wife is the correspondent for Swedish Public Radio.
Yes.
We hear her on Swedish radio all the time, explaining what's going on in America to a Swedish audience. But your research has focused on transcultural interactions in film history, reception studies, and issues of cultural translations. You understand where he's going here. And you are currently working on a project on the Swedish-American actor Warner Oland, also better known as Charlie Chan. He was the guy who played Charlie Chan. And today you will speak about that project, and the title is The Swedish Peril, Warner Oland and the Birth of Film Propaganda. Kim, please.
Thank you so much, Doug, and thank you for having me here. I'm very excited to be here. It's my first time. I'm sorry? Oh, sorry, speak up. It's my first time here at Augustana, Rock Island, and I'm very excited to be here. So thank you, and it's very... I'm excited to be here for this celebration of you as well, Doug. It's been wonderful. So my name is Kim Fahlstedt, and I am a film historian. And today I'm going to talk a little bit about this project on Warner Oland that I have been working on for the past, I think it's 4 years. It might be longer, but at this time it's kind of all of a blur. I'm writing a book about Oland, which I call a cultural biography on this movie star. And I tried to investigate Warner Oland not just through his personal biography, but also through his movie star persona. I'm trying to understand him and investigate him as what Mary Louise Pratt calls a transcultural contact zone. And Pratt defines these contact zones as social spaces where disparate cultures meet, clash, and grapple with each other, often in highly asymmetrical relations of domination and subordination. And in my take, the notion of the transcultural contact zone and how I use it in this study is that it allows me to study the relations, interactions, and reconfigurations of the cultural expressions inherent in Warner Oland's discursive movie star persona. Let's see if I can figure this out. That was the wrong way around. Oh, here we go. So, the book I'm writing is written in Swedish, and the decision to write in Swedish came as sort of a challenge to myself, as my working language has been English for the past more than 15 years, I think, since I was doing my master's in film studies. I'm used to thinking and writing about transnational cultural history in English, and frankly I wanted to see what happened if I did it in Swedish. I also thought I could frame this book a little bit differently, and the history that I'm discovering and recounting if I wrote it in Swedish. And for example, one of the book's main themes is cultural translation and adaptation. And I wanted to see what happened if I started out from a Swedish point of view rather than writing about Warner Oland solely in the context of being an American movie star in the American film industry. And so far I found that the parameters have kind of shifted a little bit by writing in Swedish and thinking in Swedish about this mostly American and Americanized actor. So, but, however, in order to not commit complete harakiri of the career, this Swedish book comes with a string of articles published in English. The first one is already out, which can be found in this book, Nordic Film Cultures and Cinemas of Elsewhere. It's edited, among others, by Warner Oland. The article deals with the death of Warner Oland and the media coverage of his death. So today I wanted to talk about something slightly different. I want to talk about a different part of his career. I want to talk about how he got started in the movies in the 1910s. And I especially want to talk about a pivotal role which set him on the path towards becoming an unwilling cultural icon of the movies. But as I can imagine you are thinking now is, who is Warner Oland? I think we can do with a reminder here, and for some of you, maybe a first meeting with this interesting man. Warner Oland was a Swedish-American actor who became famous and infamous for his portrayals of oriental characters in Hollywood cinema in the 1920s and 30s. He was the first actor to play Fu Manchu as a leading role, and was beloved and scorned for his portrayal of the Chinese-American detective Charlie Chan, which Doug just mentioned. And the role as Charlie Chan he reprised 17 times in the 1930s over a period of 8 years, so that's a lot of movie making. In many ways, Oland was one of Hollywood's original screen orientals. During a time where studios, producers, and directors rather would put white actors in makeup than cast black or Asian actors in important black or Asian roles, Oland was a character actor who frequently appeared in yellowface as Chinese or Japanese villains. Even as early as the 1920s, a time during which Hollywood became the center of the film world, an industry whose products could be found in movie theaters all across the globe, Oland and his screen Chinamen were recognized as veterans of Hollywood cinema. And this is mainly how he has been remembered, and also maybe the reason why he has been forgotten. As an actor who appeared in yellowface more than anyone else, who made a career out of racist stereotypes, and who, because of this, after his death in 1938, especially in Sweden, has kind of been like taken out of film history. While he made more films in Hollywood than any other Swedish actor have ever even come close to, including movie stars like Greta Garbo, Ingrid Bergman, and even Max von Sydow, who I think might be closest. He is never mentioned in retrospective historizations of Sweden's proud contribution to international film history. He's a little bit more well-known in the United States, or at least his most famous character, Charlie Chan, still exists as a coordinate in the universe of American popular culture. For example, a renowned anthology series of fiction from Asian American writers in the 1990s and 2000s was titled Charlie Chan is Dead, and I think the second one was called Charlie Chan is Dead too, which is understandable. And Thomas Pynchon, for example, seems to reference Charlie Chan whenever he gets an excuse to. There's a lot of space on those pages. And interestingly, going together with Erica's talk is that the ethnic confusion was a key theme in Oland's persona and followed him throughout his career. And that is also something that comes up whenever I tell people about this project. So whenever I do, and I tell them about Warner Oland, the first reaction is often and generally curiosity, but also disbelief. The first question is often, how could a burly man from the inland of Västerbotten, where he was from, get away with playing Chinese characters? Did he even look Chinese? And when I say, no, not really, and perhaps show a picture, the speculation begins. The second question is often about Oland's own heritage. For example, he has marked cheekbones, or had marked cheekbones. So people often ask me if he perhaps had some Sami blood in him, because of also where he was born, in Västerbotten. And while this could be true, and people from the town of Bjurholm, outside of Umeå, where Oland was born and spent the first 10 years of his life, have told me that they all have a little Sami in them, I've yet to find any Sami lineage, ancestors in Oland's personal lineage, and I've done quite a lot of genealogy studies on Warner Oland. Still, today, just like around the time when Oland regularly appeared in the movies, people seem to want to keep searching for answers about this conundrum of Warner Oland's appearance, of Warner Oland and this kind of ethnic confusion that goes with him in his appearance. But as I will show today, the answer to why Oland worked as a screen oriental does not lie in his genealogy, but rather in the way he was presented to the audience. Today I will talk about Oland's original role as an Asian character, who was behind it, and why it came to have such an impact on his career, and how audiences saw him. So, in 1915, after having struggled as a Broadway actor for several years, Oland needed money. Up until then, he had put all that he ever made into his own theater productions, and his dream was to introduce August Strindberg to an American audience. He did make several attempts between 1910 and 1914 at gaining traction for his own translations of the Swedish author, which was among the first translations of Strindberg to be published in the United States. But the New York audience thought that Strindberg was too bleak and frankly too horrible, and Oland too pretentious. Oland blamed other factors, such as the sinking of the Titanic, but the truth is that no one ever really came to see his shows. But in 1915, to not completely give up on his dream of making it as a serious Broadway actor, Oland had to fall back on a relatively new way of making money for struggling actors. He began accepting roles in the movies, many of which around this time were produced and made across the Hudson in Fort Lee, New Jersey. His first successful role came against the newly minted movie star Theda Bara, a Jewish girl from Ohio who had also been recently reinvented as a film vamp by William Fox. The film was called Sin, and Oland played the villain. So, after his initial success, Oland began to repeatedly be cast as villains in movies and in movie serials, in film serials. Around this time, film serials were all the rage in the United States. Similar to today's TV dramas, the serials were episodic films broken into installments. A film serial could contain up to 15 episodes, which gave directors and producers a lot of time to develop narrative arcs and suspense. The main difference between latter forms of TV and streaming entertainment, the kind we're used to watching today, is that the film serials of 1915 were more multimedial. Movie studios partnered with newspaper outlets, and each week a new episode would be available both in written form and in the movie theaters. This format created an immense focus on the actors that played in the movie serials, as they were exposed both through the film medium and in syndicated newspapers all across America. The serials gave birth to some of the movie's brightest shining stars. Young and adventurous heroines like Pearl White and Grace Cunard kept audiences coming back each week to see them put into the most dangerous situations and always escape last minute through some unmissable feat of athleticism or smartness. The fact that Oland did well as a villain against Theda Bara put him in a good position to get more work in serials. So, Oland began taking the ferry across the Hudson more frequently to go into the woods of New Jersey to chase down young girls, and in the backlots of Fort Lee and Jersey City to play a movie villain. Given the demand for movie serials, studios moved to produce even more film serials. So to make sure that they met the demands of the audience, the storylines and the characters of these film serials became more and more formulaic. The pace of production was high, and writers often wrote new episodes during the filming. So to keep things interesting, writers often turned to current events from newspapers and fictionalized them as events in the serials. So this in turn led to this kind of synergy effect where the line between fact and fiction was blurred, and as the actual stories and the fictional stories often could be published in the same paper and then was amplified in the movie theater version. So Warner Oland's newfound gig as a serial villain gave him a lot more money than he had ever had before. In 1916, he and his wife, painter Edith Schön, moved from their bohemian digs in Midtown to the more fashionable Upper West Side, a neighborhood that spoke of an upward trajectory in terms of social status. The move to 86th Street made it easier for Oland to commute across the Hudson, and it wasn't too far away from Broadway, although he had less and less reason to go down there anymore because he was so busy being a movie villain. The movies and serials had given Oland a shot at a more comfortable life, although he had to put away his dream of becoming a more serious actor as part of the bargain. So Oland came from immigrant working class, but his wife came from a fine Massachusetts family. And it's likely that the Schön family connections had something to do with Oland's new address. Close by lived Edith's brother, Clarence Schön, a justice on the New York Supreme Court. And Clarence Schön, in turn, had an even more powerful backer, who also lived close by. Since the early 1900s, Clarence Schön had worked as a close legal advisor to one of the most powerful men in America. 2 blocks away from the Oland's new address, down on Riverside Drive, was the Clarendon House, and there lived Schön family friend William Randolph Hearst. And as you may know, Hearst was already America's most powerful media mogul around this time, propelled through his massive newspaper machine. But after having unsuccessfully tried to run for president several times with the aid of Clarence Schön, he wanted to explore new ways of consolidating his political power without holding office. One of the ways he sought to do that was to expand into film production. He started out with newsreels, partnering with American Patria, which was one of the most well-known and renowned newsreel producers around. The newsreels offered Hearst a way to emphasize certain news stories through moving pictures. Given his syndication and already established partnerships, he already had an infrastructure in place to get his newsreels out faster and in wider distribution than anyone else. But Hearst really believed in the power of the film medium to sway the hearts and minds of the people. And on top of Hearst's mind around this time was to keep the US out of the war, the First World War in Europe. So as Hearst explored new ways to further grow his media empire through film, and fictional film in particular, he saw an opportunity to water 2 plants with one hose. Serials were in vogue, and Hearst already owned the newspapers, so he wanted to do a serial. Hearst hired the best serial narrative story writers around and ordered them to write a story about the war and America's place in it. And the result was Patria, which he called a preparedness serial. It was rather well known around this time that Hearst was pro-German and wanted desperately to keep the US out of the war. Many people accused Hearst of being aligned with the German top brass, and especially with the newly formed German Ministry of Propaganda. But Hearst didn't really care and took a calculated risk about this. He saw Patria as a way to further the message pounded out on a daily basis in his newspapers. And that message was that Germany was not the real enemy. So Hearst framed Patria, a fictional serial film, as a form of public service announcement, where he poses Japan and Mexico as the real enemy and not the Germans. Meanwhile, newspapers reported daily on German spy activities in the US, and arms factories, bridges, and munitions shipments across the Atlantic were getting blown up left and right all across America. But Hearst was smart, undoubtedly, and knew about the impact of propaganda, so he told his writers to rewrite these real-life events and put them into his serial film. One of these events was the Black Tom explosion in 1916, where German agents set fire to a munitions depot just south of Manhattan, which resulted in an enormous explosion, which cracked the Brooklyn Bridge, put shrapnel in the Statue of Liberty, and was felt as far away as Philadelphia. Hearst had sent a newsreel team to cover the devastation immediately upon the explosion. And these scenes he later reused and cut into the fictional series of Patria, but pointing the finger to Japanese sabotage rather than German sabotage. We will get to Oland soon, I promise. So, the overall theme of Patria could be described as American spunk and metal going up against the evil Yellow Peril. The plot in Patria follows Patria Channing, played by dancer and Manhattan it girl Irene Castle, the young heir of the largest fortune in America, a new director of the country's largest arms company. Patria is also the proprietor of a secret security fund of $100 million left behind by her late but very patriotic father to aid the country in developing a robust defense against illicit foreign powers. This illicit power is personified by the mysterious and deceitful Baron Hiroki, a Japanese diplomat in title, but in reality the leader of a secret Japanese spy ring. After having failed to negotiate an arms deal with Patria, Hiroki turns to nefarious methods to get his hands on Patria's fortune. With the money, he intends to finance an unholy alliance between Japan and Mexico in order to invade the United States, both by land and sea. And in every single of Patria's episodes, Hiroki comes up with new inventive ways to kill Patria and steal the money. But the resourceful Patria, of course, always finds a way to escape and survive. So, guess who was chosen to play this embodiment of Oriental evil? The burly man and family friend from Västerbotten. Dressed in kimono and with makeup around his eyes, Oland did his best interpretation of what he assumed a Japanese spy master would look like. But the fact that his villain was Japanese had more to do with Hearst's political agenda than it had to do anything with Oland's looks or his ancestry. In most aspects, the Baron Hiroki character was a plain serial villain, whose characteristics emanated from an inner desire to control and bend the world to his will. And now finally we get to watch a little bit of some outtakes from this film. So Patria, as many films from the 1910s, does not exist in its entirety. But quite unusually, it exists at least an hour of this 15 episode long and several hours long serial. And some of it is available on YouTube. We're just going to watch a short clip here, but you can find an hour of this on YouTube later if you're interested. I'm not, is this?
You might need to use the mouse.
Oh, okay.
So this is just to get an idea of Oland's style of acting and how he portrayed this Japanese spy master.
His henchmen are actually played by Japanese-American actors, which was often the case during this time in Hollywood.
Who was also very famous. I just wanted you to the money for that, but this is actually quite early in the serial, so a lot more stuff happens basically. So. No, I don't know.
I think it's controlling the YouTube.
Oh, so yeah, I got
Better
it.
background, it should.
This is what you warned me about, dog.
Here we go.
So here's the crux of my talk. As Oland did not really have any priors playing Orientals, either on stage or in the movies, what mattered was his, first of all, his family ties to Hearst, who quite famously liked to hire people in his social circle. Irene Castle, for example, had been his dance teacher, and it was rumored that she was also his lover for a brief time. Later in Hearst's life, when he became a film mogul, he would invest in MGM and demand that they put his girlfriend, Marion Davis, as top billing in their most prestigious films. But there was also the fact that Oland was a tried and tested serial villain during a time in which movie stardom was still a developing mass media phenomena. The fact that audiences would recognize and accept a certain actor in a certain type of role was very important. Oland was a seasoned actor who could play the part. The fact that he had to do it in yellow-face makeup and oriental garb was an added kind of masquerade in this case. So it did not really have anything to do with a mysterious connection to the Sami people or Oland himself, as Oland himself later in his career would joke, a result of the Mongolian invasions of Lapland. So, as I move towards the end of my talk, so why was this first Oriental role so important in shaping Oland's future? Because of the exposure. Patria played everywhere in the United States during a very sensitive time in this country. When the serial premiered in the spring of 1917, the depiction of Japan as America's real enemy led to a foreign affairs scandal. Japanese officials took umbrage with the portrayal as Japan, in reality, was an ally to the United States. More generally, there was a very strong support for the U.S. entering the war as an ally to Great Britain and France. And here, Patria was seen as a scandalous piece of propaganda. People protested loudly outside theaters and wanted the serial shut down. The problem wouldn't go away, and led all the way to the White House and President Woodrow Wilson. After having gone across Rutgers Park to see a few episodes of Patria, Wilson realized that the political headache, that he had once again been caused a political headache by one of his nemesis, William Randolph Hearst. So Woodrow Wilson tried to get the movie taken out of movie theaters, but he held no legislative power as a movie censor. So instead he wrote a stern letter to the director of American Pate, who in turn sent the missive on to Hearst. And Wilson focused on Oland in his letter. He wrote, "May I not say to you that the character of the story disturbed me very much. It is extremely unfair to the Japanese, and I fear that it is calculated to stir up a great deal of hostility, which will be far from beneficial for the country, and indeed will, particularly in the circumstances, be extremely hurtful." The White House continued to pressure Hearst to change Oland's nationality and take out all the Japanese scenes. After resisting for a while, they changed their mind and did just that. And the solution was to rename Oland's character and give him a Mexican name and change his nationality to Mexico. So Baron Hiroki became Senor Manuel Morales. The thing is, most of the episodes had already been shot and shown in the movie theaters, And Oland, despite his new name, still wore a kimono and appeared in yellowface. Somehow this appeased Woodrow Wilson, and he thought the matter done and settled. Anyway, after the war, William Randolph Hearst was accused of treason, and a Senate hearing, which investigated how German propaganda had influenced the American public, highlighted Oland's role in Patria as particularly problematic. The hearing concluded that while the German propaganda ministry had indeed set up a plan to use Hearst's anti-Asian and pro-German sentiments as a diversion for the American public, it was impossible to prove that Patria had been commissioned directly by the Germans. Instead, the lasting legacy of Hearst's preparedness serial was to invent and introduce Warner Oland to audiences as an oriental villain, a role he would continue to play for the rest of his career. So, a few conclusions. Oland became a screen oriental, a role he continued to play for over 20 years, out of circumstance. He was cast as a capable and available serial villain, not because of his oriental looks or his lineage. The exposure of the Baron Hiroki role made Oland stand out for audiences and film producers who kept seeing him as an oriental in film. In that sense, Oland's ethnic plasticity and the ethnic confusion was painted onto him. He was oriental because movie audiences accepted him as such. Yet, ethnic confusion became the central node of Oland's movie star persona, and audiences, journalists, and studios kept looking for an Asian connection in Oland's lineage throughout his career. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Kim, for this interesting exploration of Warner Oland and who he was and how he was perceived. Again, an exercise in these stereotypes and in our creations of ethnic identities and what they can be. We have a few minutes before we have a coffee break, and I'm sure there are questions. Jonas Björk, yes?
I just wondered when you said in the beginning that he was largely forgotten in Sweden. I recall, I'm dating myself here, that in the 70s, Swedish public television released a bunch of old Charlie Chan movies. I think because they had no money and they got them really cheap.
Yeah.
But I don't know if you look into whether, because I remember watching them with my friends and they were out of date back then.
Right, yeah. So I think there were waves of kind of recognition, and that was the case also in the United States, especially in the 1950s when television came around and they started doing reruns of old films, and they were looking for cheap films such as the Charlie Chan films to do that. Being shown on Swedish television. I'm not sure that you could show a Charlie Chan film on Swedish television today without getting into a lot of trouble. But I think what I want to emphasize is that he is not seen as part of Swedish film history necessarily, and I argue that maybe he should. Yes?
So, following up on that, what do you think is the reason for his ostracism from Swedish film history then? Is it the relative lack of cultural capital in his films? Is it due to current politically correct and perhaps over-anxious historiography? Or is it the fact that he is ethnically ambiguous, as you say?
I think it's a little bit of all of those things. He also wanted to create this myth around himself. So he would sometimes talk about the creation of these characters, and he would say that he would speak to his inner Oriental, or he would that he commented many years later about how he, for this role, figured out that he contracted his eyes in a certain way and brushed his eyebrows in a certain direction. He would surprise himself looking in the mirror because he thought he looked so Japanese.
Yeah.
I'm not sure. Oland was a really smart guy. I'm not sure how much he believed those things himself. But he was an entertainer, so he would play into this persona and willingly contribute and create this persona along with journalists and interviewers all throughout his career. So yes, there are many instances where he commented upon the creation of these characters, but they were always formulated from a position of the industry and how how things went in the industry and what would be accepted from the point of view of the film industry.
Well, in the same turn of the coin, it's not as much of a caricature as like Mickey Rooney in Breakfast at Tiffany's, for example.
Absolutely, and I think that goes back to the Charlie Chan character and why he's problematic, and even the Charlie Chan character is obviously very problematic and is built upon this stereotype of the model minority. But it is, and there should be noted that there are nuances to the kind of negativity and the positivity, if that's the way you want to see it. And I think it's super important to differentiate between those stereotypes in order to even further kind of like take them apart and figure out what they actually are. Yeah.
Yes.
Whenever you see pictures of non-Orientals with an epicanthic fold, it's usually Swedes. I can't see, we don't see him in au naturel. Did he have an epicanthic fold, or is that all pretty much a makeup job with his eyes?
I think it's a makeup job with his eyes, actually. It was very, very kind of vague, but it was. But this again is. I think he, in a sense, appeared. He appeared more and more throughout. As the longer he went in his career, he started to appear more and more as the characters he often played in interviews, and he would speak as Charlie Chan in interviews towards the end of his career, when he was drinking a lot too. But yeah, he might have had a look that was more. But again, I don't really think so, because if you look at pictures and portraits of him from his early days, there's just like there's nothing there. There's nothing Chinese there or Sami. I believe, at least, and I've looked at a lot of pictures of him. But yeah, but it's an interesting observation, definitely. Yeah.
Yes.
In a way, does this make Oland the first Swedish detective?
Wow. I'm going to say yes. Yeah. No, I don't. Yeah, it's.
You know,
So-
with Beck and
Yeah.
Wallander and what.
Continuity to Wallander,
Yeah.
Scandinavian noir.
So he was a villain a lot before he became a detective, and his detective was very much kind of seen through his Chineseness. But in a way, yeah, maybe.
You can work with that.
Yeah, it's an interesting observation. Thank you for that.
Come back in a couple of months.
I've never seen the terms ethnic plasticity and ethnic confusion, and maybe those are used a lot in your area of study, and I've just never encountered them. I think they're wonderful terms, and what comes to mind is, to what extent are those phenomena really just located in performance, or are they possible in other media?
Oh, that's a good question.
Are they your terms, or yeah?
Ethnic plasticity might be my term.
Yeah. We'll own it.
Thank you.
And
Yeah, I will.
I think, yeah.
So I think, but it is interesting. I don't really know. I think the serial format, for example, is interesting to look at that because it's both print, it's both literature and moving pictures. But I think it, without having thought about it too much, I think it might be a case that it might only be possible in movies. Because not only because of the visual representation, but also because of the expectation from the audience and kind of how movie stardom works with priors and the roles that you have done before and the kind of roles that movie audiences can imagine you in. And I think that is something that creates a special kind of power in how you are perceived. So, but I don't know. It's also a good question that I don't really have a good answer to.
I think it might be a question that we can continue to talk about over coffee, which is now served in the lobby outside here. So we thank you very much, Kim.
Thank you so much.